confuse you with the sizes, but it's a very big project. When it was being thought about and the World Bank wanted to give money to it, at the time, President Kaunda was told that he couldn't do more than 400 megawatts, okay? And the World Bank said to him that they actually never imagined that the country would grow to a place where more than 400 megawatts would be consumed by the country, okay? Today, we're using about 2,200 megawatts as a country. Now, he pushed back, and remember this is in the late 60s. Huh? In the late 60s, I think maybe only he could see that we could use so much power. But anyway, he pushed back and ended up seeing the president of the US at the time, who had a lot of influence from the World Bank, and eventually he got the 900 megawatts that he wanted. But for a long time, the 900 megawatts wasn't used for years. But what did it create? It created a very big problem that we see today, in the sense that between 1980 and 2005, we had so much overcapacity that subsequent governments never even thought about investing in power, okay? And now, in 2025, we have such a huge deficit because we've gone such a huge period without any investments in power. And those are some of the things we'll be talking about as we go through this presentation on project risks and project structuring. Some of the things you will see in my presentation, you've seen in Nkandu's, but we'll try and speak about them, and then I can just emphasize to you some of the things that have been said. I'm very happy that Unzabeka is here. I used to be part of Unzabeka many, many years ago. And Nkandu and myself actually went to the same school. So I disagree with him on a lot of things, and some of those things we'll discuss. But the reason I wanted to tell the Kaunda story is that today, the world we live in, project finance is heavily dependent on profits. In the days of Kaunda, it was heavily dependent on what the people needed, even if they couldn't see the end goal at the time. And I hope that you guys in the future can be those visionary leaders who can put country first before profit. Okay. Let's move to the next. Okay, so one of the things that you have to begin to understand as you start is energy projects are extremely expensive. So when you look at a solar project, I'll give you an example. A solar project will cost you $1 million per megawatt on average. So when you hear a guy has got a 5 megawatt project, he's probably going in for $5 million, okay? At $5 million, if we go with what Nkandu was saying, you have 30% of equity. You yourself as a developer who is going into this project, you need to have $1.5 million. Now in Zambia, it is not usual for individuals to have that kind of money to put into a project. There are a few, don't get me wrong, but there are not many. There is a man I know personally, he's developing a 167 megawatt project in the north of Zambia. It's a hydro project. But because of bureaucracy and the things that the banks like to see, he's been at this project for 11 years. He himself has sunk close to $10 million of his own money. And not even a brick is on the ground, okay? There are those types of men who you find, who are patriotic enough. And when you hear the man speak about the project and what it would do for the community, you begin to understand that money is not his motive, okay? So what we'll be discussing today, at least in my presentation, and I hope I can do it in 30 minutes, is the different delivery methods of projects, one, but also just to go a little bit deeper into the project risks that Nkandu spoke about. Okay. So if you look at this project, this image, which is very similar to something that Nkandu showed you, and I'll be speaking about SPVs as well, Nkandu. But basically what we're looking at here is, do you want to see? Do this. Yeah. Okay. In Zambia today, the most important aspect of a project is actually this person here. Okay? What has happened in the market now is that in Zambia, it is very difficult to find what we call a bankable offtaker. Okay? So let me take you back in time, actually. A lot of people are saying, no, the markets have only been liberalized now. For a long time, Zambia was closed off. It's actually not true. In fact, Zambia was one of the first movers in the region when it came up to opening up the sector for power. In 1994, when the first Electricity Act came out, Zambia allowed for willing buyer, willing seller arrangement. But there existed a problem that the legislators understood that we needed to open up, but the structure of the sector was not yet ready for that type of law. In the sense that even though they said willing buyer, willing seller, at the time there was only Zesco as a buyer. Why? Because the end user tariffs, the tariffs you guys were paying in your homes and what the businesses were paying, were so low that a new developer of power could not recover his money from the tariffs you guys were paying. So what ended up happening is between 1994 and 2019, the only natural buyer of power was Zesco, because Zesco had old assets, the ones built in the 70s and the 80s. And these new developers would come in with higher tariffs, and they could blend that tariff to make it affordable to the consumer. I hope I'm not losing anybody. Otherwise, from 1994, if you had the technology to build a power station that was cheap enough to sell to the consumer, you could have built it and there would have been no issue. The only issue would have existed is that you would then have to go into a discussion with Zesco for the use of their transmission asset. Now brings us to where we are today. Because Zesco was the only off-taker for so long, it signed multiple what we call PPAs, power purchase agreements, and we'll discuss them, with private developers that then pushed out its ability to absorb the higher costs. I'll give you a very simple example, a true story. In 2009, and it will speak to some of the political risks we're talking about, in 2009, some developers, I don't know, you know Mamba, the Mamba Project, you all know about it. It started somewhere in 2008, and in 2009, Rupia Banda, who was the president at the time, said that this project needed to go ahead. But the tariff that Mamba was giving to Zesco as a utility was higher than what Zesco could sell it at. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard the story of, but how is Zesco buying power more expensive than it can sell it? These guys don't think, you know? And a long negotiation ensued between Zesco and Mamba. And for a long time, and you know, I've seen the records, and for the record, in fact, one of the things I should be telling you is, I used to be head of power contracts at Zesco for a long time, so I have a very good understanding of where these things come from. And for a long time, Zesco used to argue that, look, even if I buy this power from you, I cannot sell it to the end user, so I'll be taking a loss on every single megawatt I buy from you. So in order to allow this investment, which was of public good, to go ahead, the regulator at the time, Zesco, and the developer all sat in a room much like this, and the regulator promised Zesco that, you know what, don't worry. By the time this power station is coming online, which is many years later, we will have migrated your tariffs to a level that will allow you to recover your costs. Okay? Now, this is a discussion happening in 2010. The project was only coming online in 2016. So this is a promissory note, okay, made under MMD government. In 2011, by the way, 2011, PF wins the election, okay? And they came on with a pro-poor agenda, okay? And Zesco attempted to make those tariff applications, but at this time, contracts are signed, the power station is already in construction, and they tried to make this application to the regulator to increase the tariffs, okay? Obviously, the regulator now, under a pro-poor government, said it was too expensive for the consumer and refused to grant this tariff application. 2014, the president dies, okay? And in steps in Edgar Lungu, okay? In 2015, Zesco reattempts to increase the tariff and makes an application for 187% tariff increase, because then it would catch up for all these years that the tariff wasn't increasing, and Mamba is coming online in 2016. And the regulator approves that 187%. What happens? Edgar Lungu is at the airport, And somebody says to him, but Mr. President, how could you allow 187% increase in tariffs? The people can't afford it. And the president says, I was not aware. What happens? The next day, the tariff is reversed. So when Nkandu is talking about political risks, these are the real things that happen in life. Now, why am I telling this story? I'm telling this story because when Mamba came online, Ndola Energy came online, Iteji came online, all these were at a price higher than what Zesco could recover. So for every kilowatt hour you guys were buying in your homes, Zesco was taking a loss. And now Zesco's financial position is so bad that no new project can effectively reach financial close with Zesco as an off-taker. And I know some of you will say, but Mamba 2 has come online. It's a very complicated story. But this is the genesis of things like this. We can move. Right, so let's talk about BOOTs. Does anyone know what the boot structure is, first of all? Anyone? Takers? Without reading from the screen. So a boot structure is what they call a build, own, operate, and transfer. It's a very simple model. Unfortunately for us here in Zambia is we often don't see this type of structure. Now let me explain what it is. It is basically a structure where a developer goes into a country, gets a concession for a large project, is allowed to build it, own it, finance it, design it, operate it for the concession period, 25 or 30 years. And then at the time his concession is ended, he's recovered his money, he's repaid his debt, he's made his super profits, he then transfers it back to the government or an agency that is nominated by the government. In Zambia, we don't have that. Well, I have never, in the power sector anyway, I know not of a project that was done under a boot structure, unless you know of one, okay? And yet, in order to make these projects bankable, at least the ones that are online now, all of them had to be given what we call a sovereign guarantee. I don't know if any of you have heard of a sovereign guarantee. A sovereign guarantee is basically a promise from the government that if the off-taker of this project, who in that case was Zesco, fails in his obligations to perform and pay you, I, as the government, will step in and pay you. It's like your father. You know, you go and borrow money and say, if I fail to pay you, my father will pay. That's basically what a sovereign guarantee is. And most people actually who look at the transactions now think that given the level of security that was granted by the government at that time, most of these projects should have been at some point transferred to the government when the concession periods were ended. But that's not going to happen. And if we move to the next slide, this is what tends to happen in Zambia, okay? It's build, own, operate. So where the concessionaire is given a project, he's given all the requisite documents to allow him to raise finance, the environment is created for him to reach bankability, but then he can own this thing indefinitely, okay? On top of owning it indefinitely, I mean, I used to look at these contracts. He has so much protection that he gets compensated for any actions by the government. I'll give you an example. There's an agreement when you're doing a power project that they call an implementation agreement, okay? An implementation agreement is basically an agreement between the developer and the government then takes obligations under that contract to perform and create conducive environment for a developer. Now, if you're doing a hydro project, there are what they call government actions and government inactions, okay? Which can lead to a payment by the government to a developer. For example, let me give you an example of a government action. If you've got a hydro project that is being fed by a river, and then the government decides that, no, we're going to put a dam upstream to allow for the farmers to keep water for irrigation, and that reduces the water flow that then goes into the power station, that is a government action. And for that, you must be compensated as a project. That one you can see, okay, there is some sense to it. Then there's things like government inaction. For example, if your water is coming from the Zambezi River, for example, and we know that rainfall is a function of trees, right? The more the trees, the more the rainfall. That's why in Lusaka it doesn't rain, because everyone is building and they've cut all the trees. If people are cutting down the trees near the source of the Zambezi and there's a reduction in water flow, that is considered a government inaction. And for that, a developer must also be compensated. Now, why am I saying this? I'm just saying this that it baffles me that these projects are not transferred to the government, because the government provides so much protection for these projects to thrive during the period under which they are in operation, that it only makes sense that at some point, even if it's 50 years, they should move into the government. But these problems extend even far beyond private developers. You know, in the 60s, I don't know if none of you were there in the 60s, neither was I, but there used to be a company called CAPCO, Central African Power Corporation. And it was at the Kariba there, so it was a joint power company between Zambia and Zimbabwe. Later on in the 80s, the two governments decided that this should split. So a lot of the assets of CAPCO ended up on the Zambian side, and there was money due to be paid by the Zimbabwean government, the Zambian government, okay? Of about $80 million, that was in the late 80s. When I was in Zesco, when I was leaving Zesco in 2022, the Zimbabwean government hadn't paid the Zambian government that $80 million, and the interest alone had built to $114 million for non-payment. So forget the idea that these problems stem from private developers. They also stem from governments. In fact, in Africa, interesting statistic about Africa, out of the 54 countries in Africa, there are only 2 solvent national utilities. The rest of the 52 are insolvent. What does that say about us as a people? Anyone? Anyone? You don't know what that says about us? It means we're irresponsible. Sorry? Oh, sorry. Do we understand what insolvency means? Sorry, my bad. You know, I'm speaking to Unzabeka. So I don't think that. So 52 of the 54 utilities in Africa, and when I say utility, I mean power utilities, are effectively bankrupt, okay? They cannot meet their obligations on time, okay? So and the only 2 that are solvent are Namibia and Seychelles. Now, what is the end-use tariff in Namibia? In Namibia, the end-use tariff is anywhere between 18 to 20 cents, okay? It's very, very high. That is what you are now paying here as part of the emergency tariff. Have you bought power recently? It's very expensive. It's very, very, I mean, I was buying 1,000 kwacha of power the other day, and it was 157 units. And I said to my wife, this is very expensive. And I'm in the higher tax bracket. So I'm just trying to explain, imagine those people who are poor. Let me give you a fun fact. I don't know if you people remember, there was a time when we had a fixed charge and an energy charge when buying power. So you had like I think it was a 32 or 30 kwacha charge first before you buy power, and then everything else. It's like 6-7 years ago. I don't know if you remember that. We then increased the tariffs because now we needed to be paying the power producers. And we increased that fixed charge. I think we increased it from 25 to 32 kwacha. We lost 25% of our customers from the homes. People stopped vending. Because what would happen is if I go and put in 100 kwacha, 25 kwacha is my fixed charge, 75 kwacha is what buys me power. Okay? Now, for some people, they would go and put in 100 kwacha, 25 kwacha is a fixed charge. The 75 kwacha worth of power would carry them for 2 months or 3 months because they just have a light and a radio, they don't have a TV. Then by the time they go in the 4th month to buy power again, they realize their fixed charges are now 75 kwacha. And when they put in the 100 kwacha, they're only getting 25 kwacha worth of power. So he said, no, I'm stopping this. After all, I don't cook with the power. I use charcoal anyway. I can buy candles. What's the point? So these are real issues for the economy in which we live. Let's move. PPP. Now, PPP is essentially what we should have been doing on the dual carriage. I don't know, Nkando has more information about this, but A PPP is basically where a private developer and the government come together and say, we're going to do this project together. So it really comes out of the name, public-private partnership, okay? In the others, there is no obligation for the government to participate. So the only obligation of the government is to provide a conducive environment for you to thrive. In a PPP, the government is actively taking a decision to participate in one way or another, either maybe giving you land as their equity contribution, giving you actual money, as has been the case on the road and in the Mamba transaction. So those are the types of structures that you would typically find. I mean, there are plenty. There's BOT, but I'm speaking about the ones that are relevant to us here. So BOOT, I wanted to explain it to you just to highlight the deficiencies in some of our policies as a country. And you can't blame it on any government, really, because this has been happening since the 80s. So it's about us and you youth now to take an active decision that moving forward, perhaps this is the method we should be using. Let's go. Okay. Before I go into the risks, I know you've heard some of these terms before. So let's just go through them quickly, okay? Very quickly. An IPP, I'm sure you hear about IPP, and you guys are journalists of some kind, right? So you probably hear, what is an IPP? An IPP is simply an independent power producer, okay? Now, when we say independent, in most cases, it stems from the fact that this has not been done on the balance sheet of a national utility, okay? However, in Zambia, which is it's not unique, but in Zambia it happens quite often, that Zesco has participated in the equity of a couple of projects. And these are also IPPs because they are done in an SPV format, okay? Now, coming back to what Kaunda was saying about the gearing ratio of 70% debt, 30% equity, you find that in Africa, actually, this gearing ratio is more 80-20. In some cases, even 90-10. I'll explain how. So when they're structuring it, they'll say 80 debt, 20% equity. But in the 20% equity, you will find, like in the case of Kafue Gorge Lower, because it was a huge project, and the president sitting somewhere in Kinshasa, hundreds of kilometers away, decided that, you know what, let's just take over the mine. Glencore was chased from the country within 24 hours, and all their machinery apparently is still there. If you go to the mine, it's still there. There's no Glencore staff, but it's there. And those types of things can happen. Let's even bring it closer to people who we know. Well, while it is not expropriation, it's a political risk you have to worry about, in the sense that if you look at FQM, for example, I don't know if you've heard about their mine in Panama. They have got a very big mine in Panama, and due to political pressures, that mine has effectively been shut down, okay? Now, you've invested billions into a country, and a political decision has been made, and that is why lenders, the banks of the sort, and equity investors will always take a view on the country risk and look at how has the country performed over the years. Do they have a democratic process? Is my money safe if I put it in there? If there is a change of government tomorrow, what is the temperament of the new government? And you know, we thought this was an African problem. Now look at Trump. Trump is exactly what we used to fear in African presidents. Now we're seeing it in the West. Largely driven by the fact that his right advisor was African. But everything stems from here. And I think this is something that we must become very aware of. I used to be in the students' union. I was in Unzasu, actually, in 2010, I think. 2010, many years ago. 15 years ago. So the reason I'm telling you this story is I understand how a leader can either drive you the right way or the wrong way. We had so many engagements with governments, and when I was in the union, I was publicity secretary. So I would always meet, at the time, Doris Elia was our Minister of Education, and we had a good president. And then I ran for president, and I lost. But the guy who won, and not because I lost to him, we understood, took the union in a different direction, you know. So, and that's at a small scale. And I'm sure even you guys in your small leadership organizations, you can understand that a leader can play a very critical role in either building or destroying an organization. Now, think about it in terms of a country, okay? So if I am bringing money, in fact, if you look at, if there's a huge correlation between foreign direct investment and the government of the day. Some might test it and say it's not a direct relationship, but there's a correlation of some kind, okay? So these are the things that we need to worry about, especially when we talk about political risk. Let's move. Okay, so I'll quickly go through these things. This is just how we mitigate some of these risks, because I think I've done about 30 minutes already. How do you want to manage your EPC risk from an EPC perspective? You have to have a fixed price, okay? So that if the EPC contractor finds things underground that were not anticipated, like the geotechnical is not what he thought, the ground is softer, he needs to put in more cement to make it tougher, that's not your problem, okay? Because he's agreed to a fixed price, okay? I'm just giving you an example. In terms of operations and maintenance of your plant, go and give guys who are tried and tested. Don't give your cousin a contract just because you want to give somebody employment, okay? Fuel supply. When we talk about fuel supply, and I think this is important, in the energy space, when they talk about fuel supply, it's not necessarily fuel as you know it in terms of petrol and diesel. Fuel is anything that powers a power station. It could even be coal. So when they say fuel, it could be coal, it could be water, and things like that. So make sure that you have, especially for like coal projects, you have to make sure that your coal supply contracts are really tight, okay? The PPA, we've talked about things like hedging in terms of currencies, but the one that's now common in Zambia is assigned receivables. An assigned receivable is basically where I'm saying, and he talked about it because he's talking about FQM, is you have somebody in the middle between, there's a project, which is a solar plant, there's a trader in between, and then there's the off-taker, all right? So in essence, this off-taker who is FQM is effectively providing an assigned receivable to this project that then gives comfort to the lender, okay? Which has become very common in our space now because we need to know that the person at the end is actually going to pay. Political risk, there's ways you can mitigate it. I don't know if you've ever heard of MEGA. MEGA is a wing of the World Bank. They effectively give you political risk insurance. And they basically say that if the government misbehaves, we will pay. Because now nobody's taking a sovereign guarantee from Zambia because, yeah. I think that's the end. Yeah, can we take some questions, if there are any? It's also okay if there are no questions. It means I was extremely clear. Yeah. Yeah, done? Thank you. Thank you.